September the 13th, 1759. The Plains of Abraham just outside the walls of Quebec. The morning mist clung to the cliff tops as 4,500 British soldiers stood in perfect two-rank formation, their muskets loaded with double charges of powder and ball. General James Wolfe had ordered each man to pack 2 lead balls into the barrel instead of the standard single shot, a desperate gamble for maximum stopping power. Below them, spread across the St. Lawrence River Valley, lay the destiny of an empire. Opposing them, the Marquis de Montcalm led his force of French regulars and Canadian militia up the slope, their white coats brilliant in the autumn sun. They were confident. They had defeated British forces before. They expected to roll over these invaders and push them back into the river. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have anticipated, was that they were about to face the most devastating close-range volley in 18th century warfare, delivered by a weapon that would dominate global battlefields for more than a century. The brown Bess musket was about to announce itself to the world. The weapon these British soldiers carried was deceptively simple, a smoothbore flintlock musket with a 46-inch barrel, weighing just over 10 pounds, firing a 3/4-inch lead ball. It had no sights to speak of, just a small bayonet lug that doubled as a crude front post. Loading required 18 separate motions. It misfired roughly 1 shot in 9. The barrel fouled quickly from black powder residue, and accuracy beyond 50 yards was little more than wishful thinking. Yet this rudimentary weapon had been standardised in 1722, and would serve as the British Empire's primary infantry arm until 1838. More than any sword, more than any cannon, more than any cavalry charge, the brown Bess musket built and defended the largest empire the world had ever seen. The French advanced up the slope that September morning in their traditional column formation, drums beating, officers shouting encouragement. Standard European military doctrine. They came within 100 yards, then 80, then 60. The British stood motionless, their muskets at the ready. Wolfe had drilled his men mercilessly on fire discipline, not a single shot until the order came. At 40 paces, barely 30 yards separating the armies, the French could see individual British faces. They readied their muskets to fire first. Then Wolfe gave the command. The 2 British ranks erupted as one. The sound was like a physical blow, a thunderclap of concentrated violence. Nearly 5,000 musket balls, each weighing an ounce of lead, launched from barrels loaded with double powder charges, converged on the advancing French in a cone of destruction. The effect was catastrophic. The historical accounts describe it as a wall of lead. French soldiers didn't just fall, they were hurled backward. The first 3 ranks of the advancing column simply ceased to exist as an organised formation. Bodies, piled upon bodies. The smoke was so thick that for a moment neither side could see the other. When the smoke cleared seconds later, the French attack had been shattered. They tried to reform, tried to return fire, but the well-drilled British had already reloaded. A second devastating volley crashed into the confused French ranks. Then the British fixed bayonets and advanced, and what remained of Montcalm's force broke and ran. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham lasted less than 30 minutes. French casualties exceeded 600. The British lost slightly more but held the field. Both commanding generals were mortally wounded, Wolfe dying on the battlefield, Montcalm the next morning. Within days, Quebec surrendered. Within 4 years, all of French North America would belong to Britain. And the weapon that made it possible was a musket so common, so ubiquitous, that British soldiers gave it an affectionate nickname, Brown Bess. The origins of that name remain one of military history's enduring mysteries. The first documented use appears in a Connecticut newspaper in 1771, noting that colonists should take Brown Bess on your shoulder and march. By 1785, the Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue defined it as soldiers' slang for a firelock, and to hug Brown Bess meant to enlist in the army. But where did the name come from? Several theories compete. Some suggest brown refers to the walnut stock's natural colour, though early muskets had black-painted stocks. Others point to russeting, a browning process used to prevent barrel corrosion, though this treatment wasn't introduced until well after the name was in common use. The term might derive from the German Braunbüchse, meaning brown gun or strong gun, a reference to King George I's Hanoverian origins. Bess presents even more possibilities. Some believe it honoured Queen Elizabeth I, though she'd been dead over 100 years when the musket was standardised. Others suggest it was the counterpart to an earlier pike called the brown bill. It might simply be the feminine companion that a soldier could expect to have, a term of affection for the only reliable companion in battle. Whatever its origins, the name stuck, and it became synonymous with British military power. But the brown Bess wasn't always British. The story begins in 1688, when William of Orange landed in England with an army of Dutch and foreign troops carrying a mixture of matchlock and flintlock muskets. His wars against James II's Irish loyalists at the Boyne and Limerick were fought with this hodgepodge of weapons, and the flintlock muskets gave William's forces a critical advantage. The flintlock mechanism represented a significant technological leap. Unlike the matchlock, which required a soldier to carry a slow-burning cord soaked in saltpeter and lower it to the priming pan to fire, the flintlock used a piece of flint clamped in a cock that struck a steel frizzen, creating sparks that ignited the powder. It was faster, more reliable in wet weather, and eliminated the glowing match that gave away positions at night. But England's arms industry was chaotic. Each regiment's colonel contracted individually for weapons, resulting in muskets of wildly different calibers, designs, and quality. Ammunition supply was a nightmare. Repairs in the field were nearly impossible since parts weren't interchangeable. After the War of Spanish Succession ended in 1713, the Board of Ordnance recognised this had to change. On September 15, 1714, the board issued a contract that would transform military manufacturing. Not a contract for muskets, but for a system. They would establish a standard pattern musket and maintain a stockpile of standardised components at the Tower of London. Private contractors, primarily in Birmingham for metal parts and London for assembly, would manufacture to exact specifications. Quality control would be ruthlessly enforced. The idea faced fierce resistance. The London Gunmakers' Company saw it as a threat to their traditional monopoly. Private contractors complained about the rigid specifications. Regimental colonels disliked losing control over their unit's armament. But the Board of Ordnance persisted, and in 1722 they finalised the King's Pattern musket. Production began in 1728. The first muskets were issued to troops in 1730, marking the birth of the Longland Pattern, the first true brown Bess. The Longland Pattern was a substantial weapon, 62.5 inches long overall, with a 46-inch barrel of .75-inch caliber. It weighed 10.4 pounds without the bayonet, over 11 pounds with it. The stock was solid walnut. The lock plate was curved in what collectors call a banana shape. Brass furniture, meaning the trigger guard, butt plate, and ramrod pipes, adorned the weapon. A steel ramrod, though early versions used wood, extended nearly the full length of the barrel. The socket bayonet, 17 inches of triangular steel, fitted over the muzzle, transforming the musket into a 6.5-foot pike. This design choice was crucial. Earlier plug bayonets inserted into the muzzle, meaning soldiers couldn't fire with bayonets fixed. The socket bayonet allowed firing and close combat simultaneously, combining the pike and the firearm in one weapon. The manufacturing process was a marvel of 18th century industry. In Birmingham's growing gun quarter, specialised craftsmen forged barrels from iron strips, hammer welding them around mandrels to create smooth bores. The barrels were then proved, test-fired with excessive powder charges to ensure they could handle battlefield conditions. Those that survived received proof marks. Lock mechanisms came from separate workshops, with dedicated specialists crafting springs, frizzens and cocks to exact specifications. These components travelled to London, where setter-uppers at the Tower of London or contracted assemblers fitted them to finished, stocks shaped by rough stockers from walnut blanks. The level of quality control was unprecedented. Each component had to match the pattern musket stored in the Tower's pattern room. Inspectors checked dimensions, tested function, and rejected anything substandard. The brass furniture had to be specific weights. The stock had to be carved to precise measurements. Even the ramrod had to be exactly the right length and diameter. This standardisation meant that a musket assembled in 1732 could share parts with one made in 1760, a revolutionary concept. The Longland pattern first saw major action in the War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s. British soldiers carrying these muskets fought at Dettingen in 1743, where King George II personally led troops into battle, the last British monarch to do so. They served throughout the Jacobite Rising of 1745, where government forces crushed Bonnie Prince Charlie's Highland army at Culloden in 1746. The muskets proved their worth in close-range volley fire, the tactic that would dominate Brown Bess employment for decades. But the Longland pattern had limitations. At 62 inches, it was unwieldy in close terrain. Soldiers in light infantry roles and Marines found it cumbersome. Testing revealed that shortening the barrel didn't significantly reduce accuracy, which was marginal to begin with. In 1740, a shorter variant appeared for dragoons and Marines with a 42-inch barrel. This became the Shortland pattern, officially standardized in 1768. The Shortland pattern measured 58.5 inches overall and weighed 10.5 pounds, slightly heavier than its longer predecessor, due to brass replacing some iron components. It handled more easily, particularly in wooded terrain or aboard ships. The shorter barrel made little difference in effective range since smoothbore muskets were inherently inaccurate beyond 100 yards regardless of barrel length. The 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 1763, saw both patterns employed across the globe. In Europe, British troops fought alongside Frederick the Great of Prussia against France and Austria. In North America, the conflict became known as the French and Indian War, and Brown Bess muskets decided the fate of a continent. The capture of Quebec in 1759, with its dramatic double-loaded volleys, was just one engagement among many. British forces also took Louisbourg, opening the sea route to the St. Lawrence. They captured Montreal. They secured the Ohio River Valley. Each victory was built on disciplined volleys of musket fire. In India, Robert Clive's victory at Plassey in 1757 established British dominance on the subcontinent. Clive's forces, armed with Brown Bess muskets and supported by artillery, defeated a much larger army allied with the French. The battle was as much about tactical positioning and political manoeuvring as firepower, but when combat came, British musketry proved decisive. The Brown Bess muskets used in these global campaigns shared common characteristics but showed evolutionary changes. The 1742 Longland pattern added a reinforcing bridle to support the priming pan. The 1756 version officially adopted the steel ramrod, which had been seeing irregular use for years. Steel ramrods were stronger and didn't break as easily as wooden ones, crucial in the heat of battle when ramming ball and powder down a fouled barrel required force. Each musket fired a lead ball weighing approximately an ounce, though the actual projectile was 0.71 inch diameter, slightly smaller than the 0.75 inch bore. This windage, the gap between ball and barrel, served two purposes. First, it allowed faster loading since the ball dropped down the barrel more easily. Second, it reduced powder fouling. The black powder of the era created substantial residue, and without windage, barrels became so fouled after a few shots that loading became nearly impossible. The standard load was 6 drams of powder, about 165 grains, though soldiers often used less depending on powder quality. The ball was wrapped in a paper cartridge that also held the powder. To load, a soldier bit open the paper cartridge, poured a small amount of powder into the priming pan, closed the frizzen, poured the rest down the barrel, inserted the ball still wrapped in part of the paper as wadding, and rammed it home with the ramrod. 18 separate steps if done by the manual. A well-trained soldier could manage 3 shots per minute, sometimes 4 in ideal conditions. This rate of fire was critical because musket combat wasn't about individual marksmanship. It was about volume of fire. The smoothbore barrel meant bullets tumbled and deviated unpredictably. Wind affected them. The windage meant they started wobbling the moment they left the barrel. A soldier aiming at a man-sized target at 100 yards might hit, but odds were against it. Tests conducted in the 19th century found that at 100 yards, a single musket shot had perhaps a 10 to 15% chance of hitting a man-sized target. At 50 yards, the odds improved to maybe 30%. At 25 yards, hits became more likely than misses. But put 100 men in a line and have them fire simultaneously at an advancing column at 50 yards, and dozens of balls will find targets. This reality shaped tactics. Armies deployed in linear formations 2 ranks deep, stretching across battlefields in unbroken lines hundreds of yards long. Officers drilled soldiers endlessly on maintaining formation, moving in step, executing wheel movements and changes of front without breaking the line. The line maximized firepower. With 2 ranks, every musket could bear on the enemy. The rear rank could fire over the shoulders of the front rank, or fire independently in rolling volleys, where sections fired sequentially, maintaining continuous fire. When facing cavalry, infantry formed squares, hollow formations, with muskets and bayonets facing outward in all directions. Cavalry couldn't break properly formed squares because horses won't charge into a wall of bayonets. The psychological effect of massed musketry was as important as the physical damage. The sound alone was overwhelming. A battalion volley, hundreds of muskets firing together, created a thunderclap that could be heard for miles. The smoke, thick and acrid, obscured vision. The smell of sulphur and saltpeter filled the air, and the effect on human bodies struck by 1-ounce lead balls was horrific. A musket ball didn't kill cleanly. It shattered bones, tore through organs, created massive wound channels. The relatively slow velocity, around 1,000 feet per second, meant balls often stayed in the body, carrying cloth fragments that caused infections. Field medicine of the era couldn't deal with such wounds effectively. A shot to the torso usually meant death, if not immediately then from subsequent infection. Limb hits often required amputation. Even survivors faced disabilities and pain for life. The American Revolution, beginning in 1775, saw brown Bess muskets on both sides. The British forces, both regulars and German auxiliaries, carried primarily short land pattern muskets, and some remaining longland examples. The Continental Army and American militia forces were armed with whatever they could acquire, which initially meant captured British muskets, weapons seized from colonial armories, and a hodgepodge of civilian hunting arms. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. At Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, when the shot heard around the world began the Revolutionary War, British soldiers of the 43rd Regiment of Foot, armed with Brown Bess muskets, faced American militiamen, many also armed with Brown Bess muskets captured or purchased over the years. At Bunker Hill in June 1775, British regulars advancing in perfect formation up Breed's Hill walked into devastating close-range volleys from Americans who'd been told to hold fire until they could see the whites of their eyes. Many of those American muskets were Brown Besses. The British took the hill, but at terrible cost, over 1,000 casualties, demonstrating that massed musket fire from prepared positions could slaughter even well-disciplined troops. As the war progressed, French military aid brought thousands of Charleville muskets to the American cause, reducing dependence on British weapons. But Brown Bess muskets remained common throughout the war. General Washington's troops carried them at Valley Forge, at Monmouth, at Yorktown. When Burgoyne's army surrendered at Saratoga in 1777, 15,000 British Brown Bess muskets fell into American hands. After the Revolution, American armories copied the Brown Bess design for early American-made muskets. The Springfield Model 1795, the first standard American military firearm, borrowed heavily from the French Charleville, but incorporated Brown Bess features. American gunsmiths were familiar with the British weapon, having captured, repaired, and copied it for years. In Britain, the demands of the American war exposed production limitations. The Board of Ordnance struggled to supply enough muskets. They engaged contractors in Liège and various German cities to supplement Birmingham production. Over 200,000 land service muskets were manufactured during the war years, but it wasn't enough. This production crisis would influence the next major evolution of the Brown Bess. When peace returned in 1783, Britain's military establishment shrank dramatically. The authorised strength of the army dropped to just over 44,000 men. Musket production slowed. Stockpiles were rebuilt. Then in 1793, revolutionary France went to war with much of Europe, and Britain found itself desperately short of weapons again. The Ordnance tried to ramp up production of the Shortland pattern, but could only manage about 31,000 muskets in 1793, woefully inadequate for the rapidly expanding forces. The solution came from an unexpected source. The British East India Company, which maintained its own military forces in India, had developed a simplified musket pattern in 1771 under Lieutenant Colonel Edward Windus. Known as the Windus pattern in company service, it featured a shorter 39-inch barrel and simplified furniture to reduce manufacturing costs. In 1793, desperate for weapons, the Board of Ordnance purchased nearly 30,000 of these muskets from the East India Company. The weapon worked. It was cheaper to produce, lighter to carry, and no less effective than the standard patterns. In 1795, the Ordnance began ordering India-pattern muskets directly from Birmingham contractors. By 1797, they'd officially adopted it as the Model 1793. Between 1795 and 1815, nearly 3 million India-pattern muskets were manufactured. This was mass production on an unprecedented scale. The India-pattern musket became the most common brown Bess variant, and the one most associated with the Napoleonic Wars. It measured 55¼ inches overall, weighed 9.68 pounds, and its 39-inch barrel was retained by 3 pins rather than the 4 used on earlier patterns. The stock extended to within 4½ inches of the muzzle. The brass furniture was simplified. The lock mechanism used a swan neck cock in early versions, replaced by a stronger ring neck cock in the 1810 variant. The India pattern was easier to manufacture than previous versions, which was precisely the point. With Napoleon rampaging across Europe and Britain fighting on multiple fronts, quantity mattered as much as quality. British powder, which was acknowledged as the finest in Europe, compensated for any loss of precision in manufacture. Tests then and later showed the India pattern was as effective as its more expensive predecessors, and in some cases better. The Napoleonic Wars tested the brown Bess as nothing before. From 1803 to 1815, British forces fought across Europe, in Egypt, in India, in the Caribbean, in North and South America. The India pattern musket was there for all of it. In the Peninsular War, British troops under Wellington faced French armies in Spain and Portugal from 1808 to 1814. The fighting was brutal, often at close quarters where musketry decided battles. At Talavera in 1809, British infantry in line formation shattered French columns with devastating volleys. At Albuera in 1811, one of the hardest-fought infantry battles of the era, musket fire at close range caused appalling casualties on both sides. At Salamanca in 1812, British volleys broke elite French divisions. Wellington's tactical system relied on the brown Bess. He positioned his infantry on reverse slopes, hidden from French view until the last moment. When French columns advanced, expecting to outflank or overwhelm the British, they'd suddenly face a long red line appearing on the crest above them. At close range, the British would deliver devastating volleys, then advance with bayonets. The French, trained to fight in dense columns that prioritized shock and mass over firepower, couldn't match British firepower per man. A British 2-rank line put more muskets into action per yard of frontage than a French column, and British soldiers were drilled relentlessly on rate of fire. 3 shots per minute was expected, some achieved 4. At close range, this created a wall of lead that columns couldn't penetrate. The Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, was the India pattern's finest hour. Over 50,000 Allied troops, the majority British, faced Napoleon's army on a ridge near a small Belgian village. The musket that most of them carried was the Model 1810 India pattern, though some Guards units had the newer Newland pattern. The battle lasted from mid-morning until evening. British infantry spent hours in square formation, enduring French cavalry charges and artillery fire. When French infantry attacked, the squares reformed into lines and delivered the crushing volleys that repulsed attack after attack. One soldier of the 71st Regiment of Foot recorded firing 107 rounds of ball cartridge that day, his shoulder black as coal from the recoil. Historians estimate that if each of the 50,000 or so Allied infantry fired an average of 80 cartridges, ammunition expenditure exceeded 4 million rounds. French casualties included over 25,000 killed and wounded. The sound of British musketry echoed across that blood-soaked ridge all day, and when the smoke finally cleared, Napoleon's empire was finished. The brown Bess had spoken its final word on European battlefields, but the weapons story was far from over. Throughout the Napoleonic era, various specialized patterns emerged. The Newland pattern, introduced in 1802, featured refined furniture and a reinforced cock. The New Light Infantry land pattern, developed for elite light infantry regiments like the 43rd, 52nd and 95th, had a browned barrel to reduce reflection, a rear sight, and a pistol grip trigger guard for better aim. Only about 20,000 were produced, as the simpler India pattern remained the standard. Sea service patterns with shorter barrels armed sailors and marines. Cavalry carbines, shorter still, equipped mounted troops. The brown Bess family diversified to meet different tactical needs, but the core design remained unchanged. After 1815, with peace in Europe, attention turned to improvements. The flintlock mechanism, for all its advantages over the matchlock, had significant limitations. In wet weather, rain could soak the priming powder, causing misfires. Wind could blow powder from the pan. Even in good conditions, the flintlock misfired roughly once in every 6 or 7 shots. In 1807, a Scottish minister named Alexander John Forsyth developed fulminating powder, a mixture that detonated on impact, the basis for the percussion cap. By the 1830s, percussion cap technology had matured. Tests in 1834 compared flintlock and percussion systems. 6,000 rounds fired from 6 muskets of each type in all weather conditions. The flintlock misfired 922 times, about 1 in 6.5 attempts. The percussion cap misfired 36 times, once in 166 attempts. The percussion system was clearly superior. In 1839, Britain began converting flintlock Brown Bess muskets to percussion. The conversion involved removing the flintlock mechanism, filling the touch hole, drilling a new nipple seat, and fitting a percussion lock. This pattern, 1839 musket, retained the Brown Bess barrel and stock but used the more reliable ignition system. A fire at the Tower of London in 1841 destroyed many muskets awaiting conversion, but production continued. The percussion Brown Bess served into the 1850s, but its days were numbered. Rifled muskets, which spun the bullet for far greater accuracy, were becoming practical. The Minié ball, developed in the 1840s, allowed rifles to load nearly as fast as smoothbores. In 1853, Britain adopted the Enfield pattern 1853 rifled musket, and the Brown Bess era ended. But not immediately. Colonial forces, garrison troops, and militia units continued carrying Brown Bess muskets for years. During the Indian Rebellion of 1857, both sides used them. Surplus muskets were sold to foreign armies and private traders. Mexican forces carried them at the Alamo in 1836. Zulu warriors used them against British troops in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. There are even records of Brown Bess muskets at the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, during the American Civil War, carried by Confederate troops who'd received them from British arms dealers. The production numbers were staggering. Historians estimate that between 1722 and 1854, over 6 million Brown Bess muskets in all variants were manufactured. The Longland pattern, produced from 1722 to around 1790, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Shortland pattern, 1740 to 1797, perhaps a similar number. The India pattern, 1795 to 1815, nearly 3 million. Later patterns and conversions added millions more. No other muzzle-loading flintlock musket was produced in such quantities. This mass production was possible because of the manufacturing system the Board of Ordnance had established. Birmingham's gun quarter became the heart of the operation. Specialised workshops produced barrels, others made locks, still others crafted furniture. Setter-uppers assembled components. Proof houses tested weapons. The entire district hummed with activity during wartime. At peak production during the Napoleonic Wars, Birmingham contractors were delivering thousands of muskets monthly to government proof houses. The price stabilised around 18 shillings and 5 pence per musket, remarkably affordable for such a complex weapon. This industrial capacity gave Britain a decisive advantage. French arsenals held over 700,000 muskets in 1793, far more than Britain's 60,000. But Britain could manufacture muskets faster than France could, and British manufacturing quality was higher. The standardisation meant that parts from different makers were interchangeable, allowing field repairs. The reliable supply of British gunpowder, acknowledged as the world's best, meant British muskets performed consistently. These advantages, more than any tactical genius, help explain British success in the Napoleonic Wars. Superior logistics, superior production, superior supply chains. The Brown Bess was a weapon system, not just a musket, and that system worked. The combat record speaks for itself. From Blenheim in 1704, when flintlocks first appeared in numbers, through Waterloo in 1815, British infantry armed with Brown Bess muskets established a reputation as the finest line infantry in the world. They captured Quebec, secured India, defended against Napoleon, and built an empire. But it's worth understanding what combat with these weapons was actually like. The accounts from soldiers describe an experience almost unimaginable today. Standing in a two-rank line, shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, you'd see the enemy advancing. Drums beat, officers shouted commands. You'd load your musket, going through the 18 motions drilled into you until they were automatic. Bite the cartridge, taste the bitter powder, pour powder in the pan, close the frizzen, pour the rest down the barrel. Insert the ball still wrapped in paper, draw the ramrod, ram the load home, return the ramrod to its pipes, cock the lock, present, and wait. The enemy gets closer, 200 yards, 150. You can see their faces now, 100 yards. The command still hasn't come. 75 yards. They're firing. Balls are whistling past, striking men around you. Someone screams. The line closes up, stepping over the fallen. 50 yards. 40. 35. Then the command. Fire. The world explodes in noise and smoke. The recoil slams your shoulder. You can't see anything through the smoke, but you're already reloading, going through the motions again. Bite, pour, ram, cock, present. The smoke clears slightly. The enemy's still there, or what's left of them. Some are on the ground, others are firing back. Balls thud into the men around you. More screams, more gaps in the line, and then the command again. Fire. This continues for minutes, hours. Your shoulder aches from the recoil. Your face is black with powder residue. Your ears ring from the noise. The barrel of your musket is hot, sometimes too hot to touch. The powder fouling makes loading harder with each shot. You're surrounded by smoke, noise, death. Men are falling constantly. You step over bodies, your own comrades, and keep loading, firing. This was musket warfare. This was the Brown Bess experience. Not heroic, not glorious, but brutal and mechanical. The weapon didn't make you a marksman. It made you part of a machine, a component in a system designed to deliver maximum violence at close range, and it worked. For over a century it worked better than anything else. When military historians assess the Brown Bess, they often note its limitations: inaccurate, slow to load, unreliable in weather, prone to misfires, all true. But those limitations applied to every smoothbore musket of the era. The French Charleville, often cited as more advanced, had a slightly smaller caliber and some refinements, but its effective range and accuracy were similar. Prussian, Austrian, Russian muskets all had the same basic limitations. What set the Brown Bess apart wasn't superior technology, but superior deployment. The British Army's ruthless drill created soldiers who could maintain formation under fire, reload quickly, and deliver coordinated volleys. The standardization meant weapons worked consistently and could be repaired in the field. The production capacity meant armies never lacked for weapons or ammunition. The Brown Bess was a system, and that system gave Britain a decisive edge. The musket also represented something larger. It was one of the first truly standardized military weapons, a testament to the power of quality control and mass production. The pattern system established by the Board of Ordnance in 1714 was revolutionary, creating an industrial model that influenced manufacturing far beyond firearms. The concept of maintaining pattern examples, producing to exact specifications, inspecting rigorously, and ensuring interchangeable parts would later be applied to everything from sewing machines to automobiles. In this sense, the Brown Bess was a bridge between handcraft and mass production, between the medieval and the modern. Today, Brown Bess muskets are prized by collectors and military historians. Original examples in good condition can command substantial prices, particularly rare variants or those with documented provenance. Reproduction muskets are popular among historical reenactors and black powder enthusiasts. Museums around the world display these weapons as symbols of an era when empires were built by men standing in lines, loading and firing as fast as they could, trusting in discipline and mass to overcome the weapon's inherent limitations. At the National Army Museum in London, pristine examples show the craftsmanship that went into each weapon. At Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, historical interpreters demonstrate the loading process and fire blank charges, giving visitors a taste of that thunderous crack. At Waterloo in Belgium, the ridge where Wellington's infantry stood still bears monuments to the regiments that fought there, each equipped with Brown Bess muskets. The weapon's legacy extends beyond the battlefield. The term Brown Bess entered the language as a symbol of military service. Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem about her celebrating Brown Bess as the companion of British soldiers through decades of imperial expansion. Folk songs mentioned her. Regimental traditions honoured her. She was more than a tool, she was a character in the British military story. And that story shaped the modern world. The British Empire, at its height ruling a quarter of the globe, was built by men carrying Brown Bess muskets. India, Canada, Australia, vast swaths of Africa, Caribbean islands, strategic points around every ocean. These conquests were achieved by redcoats who'd spent months drilling with their muskets, learning to load in their sleep, to stand steady under fire, to trust the man beside them and the weapon in their hands. The weapon wasn't perfect. It was crude by modern standards, barely accurate beyond close range, requiring constant maintenance, misfiring frequently. But for its era, deployed by disciplined troops following proven tactics, backed by an industrial system that could produce millions, the Brown Bess musket was devastatingly effective. From that morning on, the Plains of Abraham, when double-loaded volleys shattered French hopes in North America through countless battles across the globe, to that evening at Waterloo when the last great volley fire battle in European history destroyed Napoleon's final army, the Brown Bess musket dominated its century. It armed empire builders and revolutionaries, conquerors and defenders, regulars and militia. It decided the fate of nations and shaped the modern world. For over 130 years, from 1722 to the 1850s, when British infantry faced their enemies, they did so with Brown Bess, and more often than not they won. And winning meant understanding not just the weapon itself, but the entire ecosystem that made it effective. The ammunition supply chain alone was a logistical marvel that distinguished British forces from their enemies. Each musket ball began as pig-lead, refined from ore mined in Britain's Derbyshire hills or imported from Spain. The lead was melted, in casting houses and poured into gang moulds that produced dozens of balls simultaneously. Each ball weighed approximately 1 ounce, 14 to the pound, though the actual weight varied slightly depending on the specific mould and cooling process. The quality control was meticulous. Balls had to be perfectly spherical, free of voids or irregularities that would affect flight. Inspectors rolled them down inclined boards. Perfect spheres rolled straight. Imperfect ones veered off course and were melted down again. This might seem excessive for a weapon with limited accuracy, but even small irregularities could cause a ball to veer wildly, and in massed volleys, every shot mattered. The paper cartridges that held ball and powder were manufactured by the thousands in arsenals and contractors' workshops. Each cartridge used a specific paper, strong enough to contain the powder, but thin enough to tear easily with teeth. The paper was rolled into a tube, one end twisted shut, filled with the measured powder charge, then the ball inserted and the other end twisted. Women and children performed much of this work, sitting at long tables rolling cartridges for pennies a day. A skilled worker could produce hundreds per day. The powder itself was Britain's secret weapon. British gunpowder was universally acknowledged as the finest in the world, more powerful grain for grain than French, Spanish or any other nation's product. The reason lay in the manufacturing process. Powder consisted of saltpeter, 75 parts, charcoal, 15 parts, and sulphur, 10 parts, by weight. But the mixing and corning process determined quality. British powder mills used water-powered stamping mills to mix the ingredients for hours, creating an intimate mixture. The damp mixture was then pressed into cakes, broken into grains, and polished smooth by tumbling in barrels. This corning process created grains that burned consistently and completely. French powder, by contrast, was often poorly corned, with irregular grains that burned unevenly. Spanish powder was notorious for containing excessive charcoal, producing clouds of smoke but less power. Russian powder varied wildly in quality. British powder burned clean and hot, producing less fouling and more consistent velocities. This meant British muskets could fire more shots before requiring cleaning, and those shots were more powerful. In tests conducted in the early 19th century, British powder produced muzzle velocities roughly 10% higher than equivalent charges of foreign powder, translating to flatter trajectories and harder-hitting balls. The powder mills themselves were dangerous places. Explosions were common. The Royal Gunpowder Mills at Waltham Abbey employed hundreds of workers who lived with constant danger. A spark from a metal tool, a stone in the charcoal, even static electricity could trigger catastrophic explosions. Workers wore special clothing free of metal buttons. Tools were made of non-sparking bronze. Buildings were deliberately flimsy, with light roofs and one heavy wall, designed so explosions would blow upward and outward, rather than sideways into other buildings. Despite precautions, dozens of workers died in accidents throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, but the powder kept flowing. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain produced over 6 million pounds of gunpowder annually at its height, enough to keep armies firing across multiple continents. The logistics of distributing this powder were equally impressive. It travelled from the mills to magazines, stored in copper-lined barrels to prevent dampness. From magazines it went to regimental stores, then to individual soldiers who carried 60 rounds in their cartridge boxes. Each step was tracked, accounted for, controlled. The bayonet, 17 inches of triangular steel that transformed the musket into a pike, deserves its own consideration. The socket bayonet was a British refinement of earlier designs, and its importance to Brown Bess tactics cannot be overstated. The triangular cross-section created 3 sharp edges and a stiff blade that resisted bending. The socket fitted over the muzzle, secured by a locking ring that engaged a stud on the barrel. This meant the bayonet could be fixed or removed in seconds, and unlike plug bayonets, it didn't prevent firing. Bayonet fighting was a specialised skill. Drill manuals detailed the various guards, lunges and parries, but in practice, bayonet combat was rare. The psychological effect of fixed bayonets usually decided matters before physical contact occurred. When a formed body of infantry advanced with bayonets fixed, their line unbroken, their step steady, most enemies broke before contact. The sight of hundreds of gleaming bayonets, backed by men who'd just delivered devastating volleys, was more than most troops could endure. They'd turn and run, and that's when casualties truly mounted, as disciplined troops shot down fleeing enemies. When bayonet fighting did occur, it was brutal and personal. The triangular wound channel was difficult to treat and prone to infection. Surgeons dreaded bayonet wounds because they often penetrated deep into the body, damaging multiple organs. The fatality rate from bayonet wounds was high, not because the weapon was particularly deadly in itself, but because the wounds were difficult to treat with 18th century medicine. The maintenance of a Brown Bess required constant attention. After firing, the barrel was fouled with powder residue, a corrosive mixture that would rust the bore if left untended. Soldiers were expected to clean their muskets after every firing, using water, cloth, and a wormer, a corkscrew-like tool that removed wadding and debris from the barrel. The lock mechanism required regular oiling. The flint in the cock needed replacement every 20 to 30 shots as the edge dulled. The touch hole gradually enlarged from repeated firings and the corrosive effects of powder gases, eventually requiring a new breech plug. Field armourers accompanied every regiment, skilled gunsmiths who repaired damaged weapons and maintained the spares that every unit carried. These men were invaluable. A regiment's effectiveness depended on keeping muskets in working order, and the armourer who could replace a broken lock spring under campaign conditions was worth his weight in gold. The standardisation of the Brown Bess made their job possible. They could cannibalise parts from damaged muskets to repair others, knowing the parts would fit. The training regimen that created Brown Bess soldiers was gruelling. Recruits spent weeks learning the manual of arms, the 18 distinct motions required to load and fire. They practised until the movements were automatic, until they could load and fire in their sleep. The drill sergeants were martinets, often veterans with years of service, who enforced discipline with fists and curses. The goal was to create soldiers who would stand in line under fire, reloading mechanically while men fell around them. The psychological preparation was as important as the physical. New soldiers had to overcome the instinct to duck or flee when bullets whistled past. They had to learn to stand steady while comrades were shot down, to step over bodies and close up the ranks. The only way to teach this was through relentless drill and then actual combat experience. Units with battle experience were worth 2 or 3 times their number of raw recruits, not because they shot better, but because they didn't break. The sound of battle was a crucial element. The roar of hundreds of muskets firing together was physically stunning. Soldiers described their ears ringing for days after major engagements. The smoke from black powder was thick and acrid, obscuring vision and making it difficult to breathe. After a few volleys, battlefields were shrouded in smoke so dense that visibility dropped to yards. Officers and sergeants guided on sound and memory, maintaining formation by instinct and experience. This smoke had tactical implications. It concealed movements, allowing units to reposition or retreat under its cover. But it also created confusion. Friendly fire incidents were common. Units sometimes fired into their own men, unable to see through the smoke. At Waterloo, several British units suffered casualties from their own side during the confused fighting in and around the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte. The evolution of tactics during the Brown Bess era reflected the weapon's characteristics. Early in the 18th century, infantry formations were deeper, often 4 or more ranks. This reflected battlefield conditions where cavalry charges were common, and infantry needed depth for mutual support and to maintain formation cohesion. But as commanders realised that only the front ranks could effectively fire, formations became shallower. By the Napoleonic era, the British standard was 2 ranks, maximising the number of muskets that could bear on the enemy. The French, by contrast, often attacked in column. A column was a dense formation, typically with a narrow front and great depth. Columns could move faster than lines, could negotiate rough terrain more easily, and presented a psychologically intimidating mass. But columns had a critical weakness. Only the front ranks could fire effectively. In a column 50 men deep, the 48 rear ranks contributed little firepower. A 2-rank British line could bring far more muskets to bear per yard of frontage. This tactical difference led to a mathematical certainty. When a British line faced a French column, the British could deliver perhaps 3 times as much firepower. At close range, this differential was devastating. French columns would advance, drums beating, eagles glinting, looking unstoppable. Then they'd meet British volleys at 50 yards, and the front ranks would simply collapse. The column would try to deploy into line to return fire effectively, but this manoeuvre was difficult under fire and often failed. Meanwhile, the British kept firing. This wasn't because British soldiers were braver or French tactics were foolish. It was mathematics and weapon characteristics. The Brown Bess fired an inaccurate ball in the general direction of the target, but put hundreds of inaccurate balls in the air simultaneously, and they become a zone of destruction. The side that could put more balls in that zone had an overwhelming advantage. British linear tactics maximised this advantage. The Peninsular campaigns from 1808 to 1814 demonstrated this repeatedly. At Vimeiro, British infantry in line shattered French columns with systematic volleys. At Talavera, entire French divisions broke against British volleys delivered at 30 paces. At Busaco, French columns attacking up steep slopes were massacred by British infantry firing from behind stone walls. The pattern was consistent. French elan and revolutionary fervour couldn't overcome the mathematics of firepower. But the British system had weaknesses. Lines were fragile. A gap in the line, a regiment that broke, could cascade into disaster. Lines couldn't manoeuvre quickly or easily. Rough terrain disrupted formations, and lines were vulnerable to cavalry. A line caught in the open by cavalry, unable to form square, would be ridden down and destroyed. British commanders had to position their forces carefully, using terrain to protect flanks and maintaining reserves to plug gaps. Wellington was a master of this defensive-offensive style. He'd position his infantry on reverse slopes, invisible to French artillery spotters and protected from direct cannon fire. When French columns advanced, they'd crest the ridge and suddenly face a British line at close range. Devastating volleys would stop the columns, then British infantry would advance with bayonets, driving the French back. Wellington won battle after battle with these tactics, understanding that his brown, Bess-armed infantry could defeat any force of comparable size if properly positioned. The colonial campaigns where Brown Bess muskets proved decisive were often quite different from European warfare. In India, British forces were frequently outnumbered 10 or 20 to 1, facing armies with their own firearms and artillery. The battles of Plassey in 1757 and Assaye in 1803 saw tiny British forces defeat enormous Indian armies through superior discipline and firepower. At Assaye, Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, led 7,500 British and Indian troops against over 50,000 Maratha warriors with 100 cannon. The battle was desperate, with hand-to-hand fighting and Wellesley himself narrowly escaping death. but disciplined volleys from British infantry armed with Brown Bess muskets eventually carried the day. In North America, the terrain and enemy tactics challenged British linear warfare. Native American warriors and colonial irregulars used skirmishing tactics, firing from cover and melting back into forests. The Brown Bess, designed for European battlefields, was less effective in these conditions. The long barrel caught on branches. The bright metal furniture reflected light and gave away positions. The weapon couldn't match the accuracy of American long rifles at distance. Braddock's disaster in 1755, when French and native forces ambushed his column and inflicted over 900 casualties, showed the limitations of linear tactics in American conditions. But the British adapted. Light infantry companies were trained in skirmishing tactics, using terrain for cover and firing individually rather than in volleys. These light companies screened the main formations, engaging skirmishers while the line infantry maintained their formations for the decisive firefight. The balanced combination of light troops and line infantry gave British forces flexibility, able to fight effectively in both European and colonial conditions. The Brown Bess musket also played crucial roles in suppressing rebellions and maintaining imperial control. In Ireland, British troops armed with these muskets put down repeated uprisings. The Irish Rebellion of 1798 saw brutal fighting, with British volleys cutting down pike-armed rebels at Vinegar Hill and elsewhere. In Scotland, after the Jacobite Rising of 1745, Highland clans faced British musketry at Culloden and were slaughtered, effectively ending the clan system. These weren't glorious battles, but imperial police actions, using overwhelming firepower to crush resistance. The societal impact of Brown Bess production extended beyond the military sphere. The Birmingham Gun Quarter became a centre of industrial innovation. The specialised skills required for gun-making transferred to other precision industries. Workers who could forge barrels and craft lock mechanisms could also make precision tools, scientific instruments, and eventually machine components. The capital accumulated by gun contractors financed other ventures. The quality control systems developed for musket production influenced manufacturing across industries. The export market for Brown Bess muskets was substantial. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain sold surplus muskets to allies, client states, and anyone with gold. Spanish forces carried British muskets. Portuguese troops were armed by Britain. Various German states purchased Brown Bess muskets for their armies. After the Napoleonic Wars, thousands of surplus muskets flooded the market, arming South American independence movements, African kingdoms, and anyone else who could afford them. This weapons trade had profound implications. British muskets enabled certain African states to dominate their neighbours, reshaping the political landscape. In Latin America, armies on all sides of various independence struggles carried Brown Bess muskets. The weapon spread British influence even where British troops never set foot, as anyone who wanted a reliable military firearm looked to Britain. The social status of the British soldier carrying a Brown Bess was complex. Soldiers were drawn primarily from the lower classes, often men with no other prospects. The pay was poor, the discipline harsh, the living conditions appalling. Wellington famously called his soldiers the scum of the earth, though he added that they made fine soldiers nonetheless. These men endured brutal treatment, inadequate food, disease, and the constant threat of violent death. Their reward was minimal, a few shillings a week and the possibility of loot after a successful siege. Yet these men held the empire together. They marched across burning deserts and through monsoon rains. They garrisoned pestilential, fever-ridden islands where disease killed more men than combat. They stood in line while enemy cavalry charged, and enemy artillery ripped holes in their ranks. They did this because they were professional soldiers, because their comrades stood beside them, and because their officers and sergeants would shoot any man who ran. The Brown Bess was their tool, their companion, their means of survival. The regimental system fostered fierce loyalty. British soldiers identified with their regiment above all else. The regiment was family, community, and identity. Regimental traditions went back generations. Battle honours decorated the colours. Old soldiers told stories of past glories. New recruits learned they were joining a brotherhood with a history and reputation to uphold. This regimental pride translated to battlefield effectiveness. Men fought not just for king and country, but for the honour of their regiment and the comrades beside them. The officers who commanded these soldiers were generally from the gentry or aristocracy. Commissions were purchased, not earned through merit, though ability did matter once an officer had his commission. These men led from the front, standing with their soldiers under fire, sharing the dangers if not the hardships. Officer casualties were proportionally higher than enlisted men because they stood where they could be seen, directing the fight and made tempting targets. At Waterloo, the British officer casualty rate exceeded 30% in some regiments. The gap between officers and enlisted men was vast by modern standards, but in combat they depended on each other absolutely. An officer whose men didn't trust him wouldn't survive long. Men would lag in an advance, miss orders, accidentally leave him exposed. Conversely, an officer who looked after his men, who ensured they were fed and equipped, who shared their dangers, could inspire extraordinary devotion. When such an officer called for a charge, his men would follow him through hell. The medical treatment available to Brown Bess casualties was primitive and often more dangerous than the wounds themselves. Field surgeons worked in blood-soaked tents, amputating shattered limbs without anaesthesia, probing wounds for bullets and bone fragments with unwashed hands. The concept of germs and infection didn't exist yet. Surgeons took pride in their blood-encrusted coats, worn as badges of experience. Post-operative infection killed most amputees. Men with gut wounds were typically left to die, as nothing could be done for them. The hospitals were charnel houses. Wounded men lay on straw, often sharing space with corpses not yet removed. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, typhus, and gangrene killed more men than battle wounds. The mortality rate in military hospitals during the Napoleonic era approached 50%. A soldier shot in battle had perhaps even odds of survival. If he made it to a hospital, his chances dropped significantly. Many wounded men begged comrades to leave them on the battlefield rather than send them to hospital. Despite these horrors, soldiers continued to enlist, fight, and die. The British Army during the Brown Bess era was a volunteer force, at least officially. Impressment did occur, and judges sometimes offered criminals a choice between prison and the army, but most soldiers chose military service, however limited their options. For men with no property, no trade, and no prospects, the army offered steady pay, food, and clothing. It was a brutal life, but not necessarily worse than the alternatives. The cultural impact of the Brown Bess extended into literature, art, and popular consciousness. Military paintings of the era invariably showed red-coated soldiers with their muskets, standing in perfect lines amid the smoke of battle. These images became iconic representations of British military power. Songs and poems celebrated Brown Bess and the soldiers who carried her. The weapon became a symbol not just of military might, but of British identity itself. When the percussion cap finally replaced the flintlock in the late 1830s, many veterans mourned the passing of Brown Bess. They'd carried these muskets, through decades of campaigning, had cleaned and maintained them, had trusted their lives to them. The new percussion muskets were more reliable, but they lacked the history and character of old Brown Bess. Veterans' accounts from the mid-19th century often speak fondly of their old flintlock muskets, the weapons they'd carried as young men when the world was different. The transition to rifled muskets in the 1850s represented an even more profound change. Rifling spun the bullet, stabilizing its flight and dramatically improving accuracy. The Patton 1853 Enfield rifle musket could hit man-sized targets consistently at 300 yards, something unthinkable with a smoothbore Brown Bess. Combined with the Minier ball, which expanded on firing to grip the rifling while loading as easily as a smoothbore ball, the rifled musket made the old tactics obsolete. Lines of infantry standing in the open exchanging volleys at 50 yards would be massacred by riflemen firing accurately at 3 times that range. The American Civil War demonstrated the lethality of rifled muskets. Casualties in that conflict were appalling, partly because commanders still used tactics developed for smoothbore muskets. Massed infantry assaults across open ground against entrenched riflemen resulted in slaughter. The lesson was clear. The era of linear warfare was over. The Brown Bess had belonged to an age when inaccuracy necessitated close range and massed volleys. That age was ending. Yet even as technology advanced, the fundamental principles that made the Brown Bess effective remained relevant. Discipline, training, maintenance of equipment, logistical support, and industrial capacity, these factors still determined military success. The Brown Bess era established these principles in British military culture, lessons that carried forward into the age of rifles, machine guns, and beyond. The collectors and historians who study Brown Bess muskets today find weapons of surprising quality. Despite being mass-produced under wartime conditions, most surviving examples show excellent craftsmanship. The barrels are properly proved and finished, the locks function smoothly. The stocks are well shaped and fitted. This quality reflected the manufacturing standards enforced by the Board of Ordnance and the skill of Birmingham's gunmakers. These were working weapons, built to be used hard, and they've survived centuries because they were built well. Firing a reproduction. Brown Bess gives modern shooters insight into historical warfare. The kick is substantial but manageable. The cloud of white smoke from black powder obscures vision immediately. The flash from the pan is startling. The noise is sharp and loud. Loading requires attention and practice, easy to fumble under stress. After a dozen shots, the barrel is hot and the bore is fouled, making loading progressively harder. Experiencing these realities helps us understand what our ancestors endured standing in line hour after hour, loading and firing while men fell around them. The Brown Bess musket represents a pivotal moment in military history, the transition from individually crafted weapons to standardized, mass-produced arms. It proved that quality control and manufacturing systems could create effective weapons by the thousands, arming entire nations. The lessons learned in Brown Bess production informed the later development of interchangeable parts, manufacturing, assembly line production, and modern industrial processes. In this sense, every mass-produced item we use today owes something to the systems developed to produce these muskets. From the misty cliff tops above Quebec where double-loaded volleys secured a continent, through the smoke-shrouded ridge at Waterloo where Napoleon's empire died, to countless unnamed skirmishes on every continent, the Brown Bess musket shaped our world. It wasn't the most accurate weapon, or the most advanced, or the most elegant, but it was reliable, producible, and in the hands of disciplined soldiers, devastatingly effective. For over a century, when empires clashed and nations rose and fell, the crack of Brown Bess volleys wrote history. That thunder has long since faded, but its echoes remain in the world the Brown Bess helped create.